I sometimes think the far right sees more value in our history, in our concepts, in the knowledge that came out of our presence in knowledge-producing institutions than we do, because they're spending a lot of effort and a lot of money and a lot of time trying to erase it. You don't try to erase something that's not valuable or that's inert.
There are a few concepts which have been popularized to the extent, weaponized to the extent, and demonized to the extent as intersectionality. It has come to mean everything from thinking about race, class, and gender at the same time to creating a new inverted hierarchy where white men are at the bottom and those of us who happen to be brown and female at the same time are sitting at the top. Well, instead of just debating the concept and the word, its uses and misuses, I thought I would talk instead to the woman who invented it. Kimberlé Crenshaw is a legal scholar whose work on critical race theory and intersectionality has literally been era-defining. Now, as well as her work in the legal field, she is now the author of a memoir called Backtalker, which charts her upbringing through the civil rights era, her losses, her loves, and her participation in the field of politics. Now, this was an absolutely mammoth recording. I don't know where we're going to end up with the edit, but we spoke for 2 hours without a break. So hydrate, get a snack, and lock in. I hope you enjoy it. Kimberlé Crenshaw, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here.
We were just talking before we went live, and you were talking about being in Europe and being in France and being in Italy and being in Portugal. And you said something about the way in which your Blackness was being, I think, metabolized was the word you used. I'm so fascinated by that.
Well, I came here a couple years ago to get away from the United States to actually think more clearly in writing the memoir. And so I went to a lot of my favorite places, Italy, Portugal, France. And I noted the difference in the way people engaged me. In France, it wasn't so much that I was seen as an interloper, or I think there was a familiarity. There was probably a presumption about where I was from, probably one of the former colonies. And it wasn't until I did not speak French that people sort of, raised their eyebrows. Oh, she must be American. In Italy, I was in Florence, and so there were very few Black people.
But there's
there.
a lot of Americans in Florence.
There's a lot of Americans, but not necessarily a lot of Black Americans. So there we have are you read as one of the few from, the continent, the African continent, or are you read as, a tourist of some indeterminate space? But I can tell you that in Italy, I had been invited to an academic conference at the European Institute. And that's a beautiful not little campus. It's sort of spread out in various villas on this beautiful hill. And so I got the information and climbed up to this place and, go into this huge facility and climb the stairs and open this big door. Clearly, you have to know where you're going to show up at this conference. I get there, and they're just breaking for lunch. Now, mind you, I'm a visiting professor from Columbia University, and I've been invited to this conference that was on migrants. So I go to get my plate for lunch, and I'm putting food on the plate, and a porter comes, and he's speaking to me in Italian, like waving his finger in my face. I have no idea what he's saying, but he's obviously not happy to have me there. And so I just sort of keep moving to the table, and he actually comes and puts his hands on the plate and tries to move it.
If anyone gets in a tug of war with me over food, they will lose.
And this one definitely lost. That's the one thing I will fight about as much as anything else.
Oh yeah, you'll lose a finger.
Do not take my food. So we're doing this back and forth, and finally he gives up and goes to talk to, I guess, whoever it was who had dispatched him to come and, intercept me. It turns out this is the organizer of the conference. And after some embarrassing back and forth, he finally comes over to me and apologizes. And says, it's not what you think. And I said, well, what do I think? Right? What do I think?
And I bet this conference organizer, when you hit him with, and what do you think? It's just going, please, for the ground, swallow me up right now. Yes, I do not want to give an answer to this question.
Because it's clear that they saw me as somebody who had stumbled into that space. Now, how you stumble over the river and through the woods and up to the villa you go is beyond me. But that was an easier thing for them to infer than the fact that I was the Columbia law professor who was coming to a conference on migration. It was just sort of out of their realm of possibility.
I mean, so I think that in this one anecdote, you've hit on something which I think is going to come all the way through this discussion, which is the relationships between race, gender, class, and also the sort of the way in which so much of our understanding of racism in the UK has come from thinking about America and has come from consuming American theorists and thinking about American history and the ways in which, with greater and lesser degrees of success, we've tried applying it to an understanding of our particular colonial history and colonial afterlife. But I think it's all there in that story that you told.
No, yeah. And I think, interestingly enough, the instinct to deny it that my colleague expressed. And I will also say there was another scholar there who knew me and did not intervene at all in this very, testy moment. Tells me a lot about how the particulars of race and racism and marginalization may change from space to space, but the instinct to deny it or to not see it or to not feel implicated by it, that seems to me to be more universal, where racial orders are established. You kind of expect there to be some dimension of it that brings in people who are not the executors of it, but don't want to get involved in it. And those are the characters and the dynamics that actually I spend more of my time thinking about than the one who wanted to grab my plate.
I mean, it reminded me. So I've got a story which is sort of like this, which is it was the day of my graduation, and I had the fucking hat and the gown, and I was waiting outside the sort of. There was a square where the ceremony was taking place. And I was waiting outside for my mum and for my grandma, and three professors who are from my department, English literature. They thought I worked there, and they started shouting at me because I didn't know the answer to their question. And then after a while, I was like, "Oh, I don't." You think I work here? And then they looked really embarrassed. And
wow.
And then afterwards at the drinks thing, they, because I told my mum and my grandma about it. My grandma at this point does not give a fuck. So, she's...
I like your grandma.
She did not give a fuck. So they come up and they say, oh, we're very sorry, but you just looked very efficient the way in which you were standing there. And my grandma was like, well, I didn't know that was a synonym for brown. She just didn't care.
Oh.
But I think about this story, and I think about so many people like me have a story like that. And by me, what I mean is, women of color with enough social mobility to get you into these elite spaces. And so many of us have a story of, I was mistaken for the cleaner. I was mistaken for the porter. I was mistaken for the caterer. And I wonder if there is a part of us in thinking about ourselves and our experiences that we kind of neglect what would it actually be like to be the cleaner, to be the caterer, to be the porter, right? There's a sort of way in which we go, well, my own marginality kind of obscures class in the way in which I'm reflecting on it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the reality is that there's been, I think, so much denial about the relevance of racial exclusion for those who are not working class, that there's an overperformance of the claim, here is, racism pure and simple. So, there was this moment when, who was it? Oprah Winfrey.
When she was being denied the expensive handbag.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Because, she didn't look like she could afford it. So that story went viral, of course, because how are you, what else can you say to defend the exclusion of a billionaire other than her appearance was connected to a presumption around class? So that traveled around the world. The person who doesn't even try to go to buy the designer handbag because she can't afford it, even though she works harder than those who can, that's a story that doesn't get told because that's a hierarchy that pretty much everybody accepts. So the real difficulty that I think these stories tell us or present for us is, how do you continue to be able to identify racism that is pure and simply based on how you look, while not regularizing, normalizing the class intersections with that? And that is something that intersectionality tries to attend to. It is our failure to do that more successfully is why there's this, is it race, is it class, without what are the class dimensions that race produces. That's what got us to critical race theory.
If you've tuned into Downstream recently, you'll know that we're running a pretty major fundraiser. We're moving into a bigger office, a custom-built bespoke unit with hopefully better soundproofing. But more space means more money, and we need your help to take this big swing as we move into Novara 3.0. Novara 1.0, we hardly had any space. We would work out of a Costa Coffee in London Bridge, and when we finally got some office space in Peckham behind a B&M bargain warehouse, we were literally sweating through our clothes because it turns out we accidentally built the set in a way which covered up the access to the radiator. Novara 2.0 is what you can see all around you right now. It's our office space, it's our studio, but we have sadly, or luckily, however you want to look at it, outgrown it. Novara 3.0 is going to allow us to do so much more. More podcasts, more live streams, more space for our journalists to work on the news and the reporting that really matters to you. And as ever, we can't do any of this without you. If you could set up a direct debit for £1 a month, £2 a month, you're going to help keep us resilient, independent of corporate interests, and able to bring you the kinds of stories that you really care about. So support a new media, help build a different politics. Go to novara.media/support and set up a direct debit today. Well, Tara, let's start with intersectionality.
Sure.
A word often used, perhaps less often understood by people who are invoking it.
Yeah.
What is intersectionality, and how did you first alight upon the term?
Well, I'll start with what it's not, because I think that's what travels most aggressively around the world. It's not identity politics on steroids. That's sort of the big one. It's not a religion. It is not a prism designed to create a new pariah class out of straight white men. And it's not an abstract concept that comes from the Frankfurt School. I mean, these are all the things that have traveled around. What intersectionality was, when I first articulated it, was simply a remedial metaphor that was meant to help judges understand why Black women, when they were bringing cases of discrimination, had a legitimate cause to bring forward. Judges had been saying something like, Black women, you can't bring a case of discrimination as a Black woman, because first you have to show that the company practices race discrimination, and you can't, because they do hire Black people who are men. And you can't bring a case of gender discrimination because the company does hire women who are white. So what they weren't understanding, which seemed crazy to me, is that Black women can experience race and gender discrimination in ways that are different and distinct from the way that men experience race discrimination or white women experience gender discrimination. They just weren't getting it. So effectively, they were seeing race as one avenue and gender as another, and they were parallel in the court's view, not interactive. And the courts basically said that the law mandated that the analysis be parallel rather than intersecting. And it just didn't make sense to me that these very clever judges couldn't figure out something that, most women of color had figured out, since they were girls. So what's the connection that I could help facilitate between the experiences that I knew to be real and the legal analysis that created this fantasy that these things were separate and distinct? So my mind often moves in pictures and metaphors and analogies. I thought, what kind of analogy is most familiar to these guys that I could say, just like this is what this case is about. So, coming to work every day, they have to pass through an intersection where they're on roads that are traveling, the traffic on them, it might be going in multiple directions at the same time. Imagine a race road, imagine a gender road, and imagine those who are subject to the traffic on both of those at the same time. That's what these cases are trying to raise for you. So initially, it was just it was like training wheels, on their bikes. Like, this is going to help you understand these cases better.
I love the idea that the way you explain things to American men is, imagine a car.
Yeah, you're in a car. Exactly. And it did, it jumped the rails, frankly. It started out in law, but it moved beyond the academic study of law and the theorization about how to think more concretely about discrimination to other disciplines. And then from other disciplines to the human rights communities. And from there, it had more of a global traveling.
How do you feel about that? Like, when it jumped the rails from legal scholarship into politics and culture and political organizing, did you want to sort of like clamp the baby reins on it and say, no, this applies here? Or were you sort of like, oh no, it's doing useful work out here in these fields?
Initially, I had no idea that it was traveling. My experience of it was like being in a cave and saying hello, and you just get the echo back of your own voice, right? And partly because it was in the law, there aren't a lot of people who say, oh, I think I want to read the Harvard Law Review today. I mean, it's just, you're lucky if you get a couple thousand reads. Really lucky. So I wasn't aware that it had gotten pickup until many years after it had after I'd written some of those articles. So my initial reaction was, oh, great. There are people who are using the framework to paint or draw a picture. I often say, look, we all are trying to grapple with this elephant. this is the part of it I can see. What can you see?
Mm-hmm.
And so people were using it to describe lots of um, patterns of discrimination and, importantly, the failure of conventional ways of thinking about equality to address those. So that was exciting for the couple years that was what was coming back. Then things got a little bit more complicated. And I think the complication actually started from interactions with other feminists in Europe who were adapting intersectionality to deal with how they thought inequality was playing out here.
And how are they adapting it?
So one of the big things they were doing was taking race out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't have that here, which was interesting.
It's going to be like, we invented it.
Yeah, there is that.
I was going to be like, this is European erasure.
And just to put a pin on that, that came to me in a conference in Germany, in which there was like a fascinating debate at a conference called Celebrating Intersectionality, and it had acquired a question mark after the title in the development of the conference. So eventually,
it's very academic, by the placement of the punctuation.
Right at the end, like a question. And I was like, okay, we can talk about it. And in the debates in the conference, there were some really, to the mat conversations about how many intersections are there? How many? And so one person would say, well, there are 11. And another would say something, a different number. Yeah. And I couldn't understand what the rules of the game were, because in my view, you can't answer that question in the abstract. It's not a grand social theory that has predictive elements to it. It's a prism for reading concrete situations. So tell me the situation, and maybe we can debate how many different axes of power are coming together in that moment to create that particular problem. But it's not this sort of thing where you can debate in the abstract how many kinds of power, how many axes of power are there in the world. You can't do it like that. And so I was curious about why they wanted to do that. Like, what was the imperative that answering the question in the abstract was meant to address?
Do you want to see us in all three dimensions? We've got another Downstream IRL on the agenda. On the 22nd of June, Aaron Bastani will be joined by Mariana Mazzucato to discuss whether or not capitalism can be reformed. For the undercard, before the big fight, I'll be talking to John McDonnell about how Labour has fared in its recent, by then, by-election in Makerfield. So get your tickets. We'll be at Earth Hackney. You can get tickets online at Dice. I mean, look, I've got a theory about it.
You got a theory?
I've got a theory about it. My theory is this. Drawing less on intersectionality, which obviously emerges from legal scholarship, but thinking about identity politics as it was framed by the Combahee River Collective, is that they are anti-capitalist black feminists who are saying our position at the bottom of the labour market gives us a sense of how this whole fucking machine is working, and that you've got these things operating simultaneously and at the same time. And over time, through the 1970s and the infiltration and the dismantling of black radical movements, the rise of neoliberalism, the smashing to bits of trade union movements, of heavy industry, all these things which are engines for class consciousness, you have these radical ideas and terminologies, but where people are encountering it is in the university. Which becomes, particularly in this country, a holding pen for young people before you spit them out in a labour market that wants nothing to do with them, basically. And I think it was Barbara Smith in an interview maybe 10 years ago who said, when you encounter these ideas in a university, you take the identity and you leave the politics on the floor. So coming back to your point about abstraction, is that I think that there is a problem here where universities and academia more generally has become the sort of the custodian, the guardian of radical thought, because then it's all fucking abstract, right? And you've got people going, okay, but like imagine you've got a posh woman of color and then there's a homeless white guy, and who's got more privilege? And it's like,
yeah,
crazy question.
So I love that theory, and I think there is a lot of truth, especially to the idea that when you don't have the fuller political analysis of various forms of hierarchy, all you are left with is the identity signifiers. And I'll say even beyond that, the way intersectionality is received as an interrogation of identity rather than as an interrogation of how structures of subordination actually interact. And that interaction has distributional impact on people who, because of the structure, are positioned in a way to receive that, makes it that much easier to simply reduce intersectionality to being about identity rather than being about power. Now, where I would go a little further in my story about the encounter in Europe is that
the Florentine encounter is how
there we are. The piece of the analytic that has to do with race and colonialism, and for the American part, enslavement, has never actually even been fully situated, even in the university. So it's not as though, and I would say in broader society as well, right? So if there hasn't been a moment of reckoning around those issues, if there hasn't been a widespread, all right, we have to at least acknowledge that this happened, then there's really nothing to erase. It's not there in the first place. So what I think I was reading from some of my feminist colleagues in Europe was class is something that they can wrap their heads around, and gender was something they could wrap their heads around. And there were intellectual projects, maybe not as centered, clearly, in the university, but there was a discourse around these that then intersectionality helped them bring together in a potential way of establishing a more complex analytic to deal with issues that have already been sort of understood. I think what I was getting was we don't have scholars that are in the spaces we're in that are actually forcing the issue. And because the scholars are in some ways marginalized, it's very hard to get jobs in these institutions. So it's easier to say, we don't deal with that here, rather than to say the fact that that is still such a feature of social life and academic life means that these issues have never really been as grounded and fronted in our various disciplines as they might otherwise be.
So I suppose, because I'm interested, I've come to accept this about myself. I don't like it about myself, but I've accepted it about myself. I'm a fundamentally political creature. And so a lot of the time, my interaction with history and with theory and with forms of narration around those things, I'm going, well, how does this tie into a political project? What does this do to political possibility? And so when I think about reckoning with the histories of colonialism, race, and enslavement, there's a bit in the back of my head that goes, this is an 82% white country. And if you lead with things which make people feel that their origin story is rooted in guilt and shame, they're going to reject you, right? Like something we know about how people interact, regardless of race, is that we run from shame and we run from guilt and we run towards a promise of status. And so when I think about what the raised salience of race and histories of racism has done in the States, I don't necessarily look at that and go, that's good for our context here.
Well, That's a very familiar critique of any race project.
Mm-hmm.
It was the critique that led us to develop critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
And let me be concrete about that. Critical legal studies was initially a project of the left in the legal academy to interrogate some of the assumptions around law and legal education. Primarily the idea that law was a neutral arbiter
Mm-hmm.
of interests, of values, that it was a science, that it was removed from politics. One of the most significant products of critical legal studies was a book called The Politics of Law, which was, sacrilege. Like, how do you put politics and law together? We rely on the myth of law being above politics as an ordering, legitimizing, set of beliefs. So to actually talk about them in the same sentence to some people, is definitionally out of bounds. Obviously, we were drawn to that analysis. You don't live under segregation. You're not born under segregation like I was and think that law is somehow this transcendent, enterprise. It's pretty clear that law is about politics. Law is about power. Law is about creating interests. Law is about insulating those interests from various efforts to redistribute power, on and on and on. So the tools that critical legal studies made available to us were excellent opportunities for us to begin to dismantle some of the beliefs that allowed for segregation to be rationalized. The idea that race is real, the idea that social hierarchy is the way things have to be, that it's the product of something neutral as opposed to the product of preferences, practices, dynamics that grew out of the United States origin and never really transcended that origin. So we were excited to be part of critical legal studies because we said, finally, we can apply these analytics to racial hierarchy and reveal that the hierarchies that we were born into are not just there, and ignoring them will not make them go away. They are able to reproduce themselves unless they are countered directly with affirmative efforts to dismantle these hierarchies. So we were excited about it. Our colleagues, not so much. They were kind of like, trying to talk about these things in a movement like this is going to be destructive. It's going to, as one of my senior colleagues said, it's going to tear this organization apart. And what's really interesting...
Did it?
Well, it did. It did. But let's be clear. This is not just a matter of like a science project. You add this to that and then it's going to explode. It's a matter of the individuals in the organization not being willing to apply to an area of interest that they are privileged in the same kind of analysis that they would be willing to apply to something else. To be 100% about it, one of the things that was said that I think kind of shows where this sentiment rests on the broad sort of historical challenges about dealing with enslavement and colonialism is we were accused of Mau-Mauing them. Mau-Mauing. So it was kind of clear.
Wow-wee.
Yeah, that's sort of what we said. Wow-wee. So you're kind of making your allegiances kind of clear here. You're not. You're on the side of the colonizers as opposed to.
You said the quiet bit out loud.
Exactly, the quiet bit out loud. And so that was revelatory in so many ways. I mean, what it did tell us is that the same analytics that we saw applying to race, that they'd applied to class, was a no-go for them, and it was a green light for us. We also began to understand that where people came out on these questions wasn't necessarily a left-right issue. You could be very left on some issues and, barely centrist when it comes to race and the histories that came out of it. So we more or less moved to another space to think about what this project actually was presenting to us. And critical race theory came out of it. We were part of the critical legal studies tradition, but unlike that tradition, we were going to turn the tools to really look at the construction of race under the understanding that while race is not real, racial power is material. It is real. And it doesn't go away just by bowing to the sentiments of the mass or of the progressives who really want to think about power.
So, all right, I'm trying to work out what I think in real time.
Okay.
What do I think? I think that the first thing that I've been wrestling with in my own politics is that there are stories which make people feel empowered to change the system that they grew up in. Mm-hmm. And there are stories which I think can make people avoidant, hostile, paralyzed by guilt. Mm-hmm. And there is a certain narcissism to shame as well, right? And I'm speaking of myself as well. Sometimes my shame is so strong that I can't stop thinking about myself. And I sort of see parallels with that when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, when it comes to class. People start feeling so bad about themselves all the time. They just can't stop thinking of themselves. Mm-hmm. And I would say that I definitely had a period of the thing I really wanted to do was shake everyone I came across and go, don't you understand the colonial history of this country, and you don't understand how it's playing out today? And I think that it never made people go, oh yeah, we can change this together. A story which was hugely impactful when I started talking to people about it was the Lancashire cotton famine. Have you ever heard of the Lancashire cotton famine?
Tell me more.
Lancashire cotton famine took place during the American Civil War. There was a cotton embargo on producing slaves picked cotton in the mills of the north of England. Now, there were areas where that embargo was broken. So in the Merseyside, where the docks were reliant on cotton shipments coming in, people broke the embargo. In Lancashire, because of the organising that took place largely through the church, there was a refusal on the part of Lancashire mill workers to touch it. And so they were locked out of the factories. They went hungry. There was widespread disorder. And many of them never seen a black person in their fucking life, right? And it came from the sense of universal brotherhood, fraternity that comes from a particular Christian abolition tradition that was strong there. And for me, the reason why that's an inspiring story is that we talk about economic interests as though people can only act in line with their economic interests.
Yeah.
And here is a story where they didn't do that. And it didn't come from guilt. It didn't come from a sense of, well, I as a white person, I'm responsible for this. It came from this possibility of well, we exist in a state of Christian brotherhood with each other. And so I'm compelled by, that shared humanity to behave in this way. And there is a real big difference from the things that I'd said before, which is, well, yes, we abolished slavery, but, we had all this going on in the Caribbean. And yes, we didn't have legal segregation here, in Great Britain, but look at what we did in Australia, look at what we did in India. The shift in people when I tell the Lancashire cotton famine story, because it's based on possibility, not shame.
I love that story, and I'm going to tell it. And I would say to you that is precisely what Backtalker is trying to do. I would also say that the story of the American Civil Rights Movement, which, we got into this by saying is the story of the United States, basically a good story or not. I would say that the turning point of the Civil Rights Movement was when students got involved and when that became a multiracial coalition. A key turning point was when 3 civil rights workers were abducted and murdered, and 2 of them were white. we have to ask, what drove those white students out of their comfortable surroundings to put themselves in harm's way in order to create a democracy that they could say they wanted to be a part of? What drove Viola Louisi, who was a Michigan housewife, to get in her car and to drive down to Selma, Alabama, and transport marchers who were demanding voting rights from Montgomery to Selma, where she was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan? And there's story after story after story. It is clear that there is a story, there is a way that people are compelled to put themselves in the position of fighters for multiracial democracy, for justice. Is that guilt? I don't think so, but I also want to say that the flip side of the critique is often not the story that you just told. In fact, the argument that has been mobilized by this critique, like we can't lead with race, we can't talk about that, has basically been to go in the opposite direction, to say race itself is a distraction. Racial hierarchy, we can't get at that. What we can all come together on is the idea that we are living in a plutocracy, that it harms all of us, and they are just using race to separate us. Now, all that is true, right? They are using race to separate us. But it's also true that racial hierarchy is still operating even inside of that. So the historic consequences of enslavement and colonialism, the distributional realities of what's happening as globalization and a whole range of other dynamics is bankrupting our capacity to actually make a real democracy real. It's doing horrific things to predicted classes of people. It's also doing it in racially and historically predictable ways. So that advice, let's not talk about race, is effectively saying, okay, that damage we can't afford to talk about because we can't figure out how to talk about it in a way that doesn't make people feel guilty. I think we have history. You just gave me an example. I gave you an example where that's not true. So I think the ambivalence that we feel about foregrounding these issues in our movements is because the stories that we both tell have not been told. They're not well known. They are not examples for us to follow. And just to be clear, the legislation in the United States that is traveling now pretty fast is directly targeting the erasure of these kinds of stories. There are groups that don't want the Montgomery bus boycott to be taught. They don't want the Tulsa race riot to be taught. Why? Because they say it makes people feel guilty. So they're legislating against guilt. What they're missing is that you only feel guilty if you don't tell the full story about how the coalitions that developed over time to respond to this or to resist this involve people of all races. There is an avenue that can be taken that acknowledges this racial harm historically in this contemporary time, that pulls people in rather than turns them away. That's what we should be trying to think about.
You know what we should do? And it would drive the far right who are watching this video absolutely fucking crazy. We should program a White History Month.
Well, let's call it that and
call
pull
it
them in.
A White History Month, and then you have the history of the Chartist movement. You have, you know, the examples that you gave of white participation in the civil rights struggle. You've got an amazing history of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa.
Absolutely.
Obviously involving white people and Indian people and black people, and the specific role of communist parties in it. You would pitch a fit if you got your White History Month.
Yeah, and that's why you're trying to make sure that none of those stories actually will circulate in our educational system, in our culture, and in literature. That's what censorship is all about. There's a politics to it. I've been saying to people, I sometimes think the far right sees more value in our history, in our concepts, in the knowledge that came out of our presence in knowledge-producing institutions than we do, because they're spending a lot of effort and a lot of money and a lot of time trying to erase it. You don't try to erase something that's not valuable or that's inert.
They've all read their Gramsci. They've all read their Gramsci.
They get that.
I mean, I want to come back to. I accept that there is a difference between the intersectionality that you were writing about and the intersectionality which has become not just popularized but almost memeified, right? It's become a shorthand, and that shorthand encompasses things which I don't think you were really talking about. It encompasses an intense focus on language and discourse, microaggressions, the idea of the discourses that speak through us all the time, even when we are not ourselves talking. And the way in which I've seen that play out in organising spaces, especially organising spaces which have a high proportion of people like me, so downwardly mobile university graduates, or are proximate to universities in any way, is that it can become utterly paralysing. A lot of tension, a lot of mistrust. And something amongst young people of colour that I've seen is that if they don't, if they're not the first to say, I'm feeling harmed right now, they kind of feel they're not doing anti-racism, right? They kind of feel that they're not being brown.
Yeah.
You know? Have you seen that? Does that resonate at all?
Of course. Yeah, I've seen it. It took a while before it became apparent to me that people who are critical of that, which I was one, then pointed to intersectionality as the reason that this is happening. I'm like, okay, wait, how did that happen? So my own take on this is that part of what neoliberalism did to politics was to individualize it, was to turn political movement making into affirmations of self, into a politics of recognition. That comes somewhat naturally when the entire political terrain has been reduced to identitarian discourses as opposed to structural ones. That disconnect, or that breaking off of the structural explanations and historicizing of contemporary hierarchies, that robbed people of the ability to base claims based on power beyond discursive power, beyond recognition, beyond, okay, I see you, I see you, I see you, I see you. And, you get that. So I have understood the impulse to say, hey, what about me? And I've understood the reaction to that, to have a whole list of things that you say before you start talking, right? I see you, I see you, I see you, and I'm going to give acknowledgement to this and that and the other. And I even have to sometimes deal with my own sense, like, okay, well, as long as we're going to go about listing stuff, how about my being able to say I'm a descendant of enslaved people? I'm like, no. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that.
I had to give him, I was working for a left-wing organization, and before we did anything, we had to do a diversity welcome, which included naming not only every race, but pescatarians, vegetarians, and vegans. And I was like, that's not what the P in POC stands for. Like, are we just naming everything now?
Yeah, and that, so I think it's important to understand the impulse. I think for critics of that, rather than saying it's this word or it's this concept, let's understand actually the intersections of neoliberalism, what it has done across the board, and how it plays out in movement spaces when it erases, an entire, set of historical realities, when it takes off the table the ability to talk about the entirety of the structure, and it only leaves these few little islands that you can plant your flag on, this is what the result is going to be. So we have to step outside of the performative pieces that we don't like and understand the context in which this is what new generations of activists have inherited. What do we do about that is more than, well, let's stop using the word, because the word is not the problem. It's the context that is the problem.
I mean, thinking about context, where does being American fit in an intersectional analysis? Because so much of, I mean, there is this huge contradiction, screaming contradiction, which is Black people in America are an internally colonized peoples, right? And the descendants of enslaved people who have been separated from and robbed of the opportunity to know their stories of origin, subject to legal forms of segregation, inequality under the law being baked in within living memory, and Black American culture has been used as an expression of soft power, right? It is a big part of how America projects itself around the world, right? I knew a lot more about American rap before I learned about UK rap. Like all of this, you have such a huge global footprint. So how does American-ness fit into an intersectional analysis?
There is no escaping that American hegemony. There's an interface between that and how our history and you know what? I'm not even going to say our history, because our history doesn't travel. That's not what travels. So we have to first start with the modalities of resistance to American hegemony that underwrites the rejection and the use of anti-Americanness to suppress race and other expressions of critique in various countries. So just to be concrete, I spent some time in Brazil, especially during the time that the Black movement was cresting there. And in working with some of our, sort of fellow activists, there were moments when some of them would say, for years we've been told not to take up the American civil rights, sort of prism or Black radical traditions. We've been told not to quote Malcolm X or, and not to bring in the music because that was American. But on the other hand, McDonald's is here, IBM is here, other aspects of American culture are not interrupted or intercepted at the border. And it's only taken this moment that we've seen how Brazilian nationalism as applied to race discourse is quite different from its application to other American exports. So what do we want to say about that? What do we want to do about that? Is there a racial project being wrapped into anti-Americanness? And is there a conflation that's happening when it's the Black subaltern that is being framed as, a colonizer in our space? So that was really an epiphany to me, because it wasn't until that moment where I realized that there was a discourse that they were managing in their own conversations about how to build partnerships between Black folks in the United States and Black folks in Brazil on some of the common ways in which anti-Blackness was embedded in both cultures. So that was fascinating.
But I suppose there's a few things buzzing around my head here, which is that I can understand the roles of deprivation, racism, structural disadvantage, which lead to Black people enlisting in the US military, right? I can understand those things, but then when you're in the US military, and you may still very much experience racism and material racism when you are in the US military, you're still drone bombing that Yemeni wedding. You know what I mean? And it sort of occurs to me that in the late 60s and the early 70s, the Black Panthers were wrestling with this. They were building connections with the Viet Cong. This was sort of staged in Spike Lee's The Five Bloods when he's sort of doing Hanoi Hannah, like addressing Black GIs in particular and sort of trying to say, why are you here dying in this jungle? They don't care about you. That's all in there. And with the most recent war in Iran, it really struck me that there was an effort to put Black soldiers, and especially Black female soldiers, front and center of a TikTok campaign to be like, we're the ones in the army and we're out here and we're about to do this thing. I'm not sure if we can just say it's anti-Blackness. It sort of feels like there is a...
Well, wait a minute. What's the it?
The it here is that there is the same way I participate in Britain being an extractive, less dominating than in previous centuries, but by God, we're trying. And a way in which Britain positions its diversity and tells a story about its diversity whilst doing all these things. There's also, I think, a use and an abuse and a foregrounding, a sort of hyper-visibility of Black Americans in the American imperial project.
Yes, all that's true. But what is that saying?
What am I saying is that it feels to me that anti-imperial piece that was so prominent in the late 60s and early 70s is so much less prominent in the anti-racist discourses of that sort of 2015 onwards moment.
So let's be clear about the split that happened even in the 60s. There was never a time that Martin Luther King was less popular than when he opposed the Vietnam War. Right? That's just, a reality. And let's also remember what happened to the racial justice leaders who took very seriously the idea that the movement that Black people were pursuing in the 50s and 60s was not simply an American civil rights frame. It was part of the global uprising of, I'm going to use the term, colored peoples everywhere. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, led the effort to charge the United States with genocide and connect that to anti-colonial movements everywhere. Paul Robeson was, utterly destroyed by trying to lead those efforts in the 50s. So it's clearly not the case that, number one, there were not deep connections that were drawn between some of our most prominent leaders. It is the case that they were systematically destroyed, right? So what's that saying? It's saying that in the same way that I was talking about how neoliberalism has distorted social justice organizing and discourse to more of an individual expression of identity, I would say the anti-everything dimension of American sort of self-projection into the world has sharply constrained, and there's a reason why the Panthers were destroyed and some of the other organizations exist, right? So our challenge is to think about what we've inherited in terms of the historical forces that encouraged some articulations and punished other articulations. So now there's just that as a general matter. But then there's the question of what do we make of individuals who are participating in an imperial, project, and where do we rest responsibility for that? And more broadly, how do we think about that in terms of the anti-American rhetoric that is frequently deployed to make it that much more difficult for marginalized groups in other countries to join in solidarity with the frameworks that are coming out of United States and other places. I think that's an important question. So one need not deny that in any imperial order, the combination of attractions, incentives, and disincentives will have consequences. It will shift people. And as you pointed out, when the army is one of the most significant ways in which Black people find their way into some form of stability, that's gonna produce something. Does that make them themselves responsible for the imperialism? That's a tough question to ask of individuals. But more importantly, does it make anything and everything that comes out of the whole radical tradition off limits for those who are anti-imperialists? And I think that's not a tough question.
No, I mean, do you think there's a missing piece here, which is actually existing communism and the connections that was able to foster? So, you talk about Paul Robeson, who was one of our people, right? He was one of the Reds under the beds. Or thinking about, so there's a phenomenal journalist called Gary Young here in the UK, and he was in South Africa for the first democratic election, and he got incredible access to Mandela's team because he'd spent time in the Soviet Union, sort of, as a young, Marx and Engels toting communist, and so did Mandela's security team, right? Because there was that deep connection with communist movements. You think about the work that was done between representatives of the Viet Cong and the Black Panthers and the organized burning of draft cards and the connection between the draft and non-compliance and all this stuff. What you have is a global political project called Communism, which exists in the Soviet Union, which exists in Cuba, which has strong parties in the global South, fostering these connections. And it is a disciplining force to Western capitalism as well. That's why this is the year of social democracy. And now we're trying to do anti-racism and anti-imperialism and all these pieces, but we don't have this big global thing disciplining Western capitalism anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely missing, especially in this moment where authoritarianism is now the global language of power. And we have not developed a rhetorical or political response to this globalization of a particular form of state power and cultural power. So there is a missing space. Now, as a person who's deeply interested in rethinking how we imagine the world we want to create coming out of this, I'm deeply skeptical about returning to forms of political organizing that themselves were also lacking in their gendered and racially inclusive dynamics. So they're in the same way that contemporary politics can be critiqued for their failure to deal with dramatic, class hierarchy that is growing worse and worse. I also feel very strongly that many of the claims to return to a class-forward framework that is conversant with communism and other forms of politics that don't have a space for how to deal with the afterlife of colonialism and enslavement, that don't have a space to deal with the consistent way in which gender has been framed over, the lifetime of these frameworks. I can't get excited about that's the way forward. Let's go back to that and really reframe it, because they were not great on issues that I think are as important and, in fact, are central to the overall project. So I don't know if this is, a moment calling for greater efforts to integrate what worked about some of these past frameworks and what didn't. But I do think that's the call at this moment. I mean, it's 100% clear that we are going off of a cliff. What's going to catch us or what we're going to try to build, on the way down, I think it's got to be informed by all of these movements and not simply, trying to integrate the skeleton of one when we know that when it was fully embodied, it didn't do everything we needed it to do.
I want to turn to something that you wrote about in the book, because I've been so wrapped up in this conversation. I have not yet talked about the autobiography Backtalker. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is the sort of pressures of asymmetric solidarity.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the demand to, leave gender, outside on the front porch when you're coming into Black spaces, and conversely, please can you leave race at the door when you're coming into feminist spaces. And you sort of say, I'm not going to ride or die for a cause which isn't going to ride or die for me. And I was thinking about that, and I was chewing over it. And I think I have a yes and, which is there is a yes and there is a, sometimes through struggling together, that is how you understand one another. And if I put their demand to understand me first, we never get to do the struggling together first, and we never understand each other. And I was sort of wondering about, how does one draw a line between saying, I'm not going to leave any part of myself out there on the front porch, and also I'm not going to treat solidarity as transactional and tit for tat.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what those stories in the book are all about, right? So even in telling one of the stories that the book opens with, being asked to go around to the back door, and my posse, who is, all male, and not being asked to go around to the back door because the back door policy is exclusively for women. Even there, I await solidarity. Even there, I perform that sacrifice in the name of solidarity. And even then, I don't give up on the we, right? But I am saying that for the we to work for me, it cannot be a permanent agreement that I'm always going to have to go around to the back door, because that is not in the cards for me anymore. I could have, and I'm sure there's some people who reach a point where the repetitiveness of the demand makes the possibility of arguing and lobbying for a different orientation unlikely. And they bounce, they're just gone. If anything, I think I might be critiqued for, why do you keep coming back?
Yeah.
Why do you keep thinking, that there's going to be a different outcome? That whole thing is of you measure, insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. Why do you keep expecting a
Tottenham
different?
Hotspur as well.
Yeah, exactly. So why are you doing that? And I feel like I do have an answer to that, which is in response to, your question. The we is still vital to any kind of social transformation. I said before, I critique sort of neoliberal individual. This is not comfortable for me, so I'm going to take my ball and leave. Well, where are you going to go with your ball? Are you going to be with all the people who took their balls and left? And is that a movement? Is it though? I don't think so. I think we have to stay in the spaces that we have built and insist that we have equal access to all the stuff that's in that space, including the legacy of the movement, including the organizing that happened and I would say largely through the work of women. It's a fight for space to help define the contours of what we're demanding and what we're doing, which is distinct from see me, see me, see me, right? So that we is not static. That we is not a noun. I see it as a verb. It's something that we consistently do as we maintain our commitment to what group collectivity does as a condition of transformative possibility.
And there's not really an easy answer to it, right? It's sort of like being married. Sometimes you drop it. Sometimes you take the argument all the way to bedtime. Like it's not always or never.
Yeah.
One of my favorite portions of the whole book was there is this, 2 pages long meditation on Chic's Le Freak.
Yeah.
And what I loved about it is that this is clearly a tenacious mind, and it's latched onto this thing, and it's like, I'm going to drive this all the fucking way. So it's not just like, I have
and that was only the half of it.
Right. And so for my generation, for Le Freak is quite an innocuous song. It's played at weddings now, right? It's the one that, it's for aunties, uncles, and grannies to get up and test the hip replacement. But your take on it and your sort of tracing of a lineage through Le Freak and Rick James's Super Freak and into hip hop culture, you went in a very different place.
Yeah, I did. I guess partly this is the tail end of the baby boomer in me. Growing up, listening to songs that lifted us and made us, particularly girls, the object of adoration and, undying love. So I was a romantic, when I was a kid and when I was a teenager. So I grew up listening to, Let's Put It All Together, let's see, Stop the Love You Save, which as I listen to it now,
shaming anthem.
Yeah, it was a little like, oh wow, and I actually remember. So Michael Jackson was my boyfriend when I was 10. We were gonna get married, me and millions of girls, especially millions of Black girls, because white girls had Donny Osmond and they had, the Monkees. They had all of these people. And
at that age, you're looking for this sort of non-threatening male to sort of hang your desires onto.
And you want to be seen and you want to be appreciated and valued. And we're already starting to get the messages, as, I write about that. We're not princess material.
You can't be a princess.
We're not adoration material.
I mean, I didn't laugh laughing at, but I laughed at that part because I had an exact memory like that as a kid. Couldn't be the princess.
A lot of people do.
I was allowed to be the evil unicorn.
Okay, there you have it. There you have it. So, and this is writing the stories that I don't think are unique to me, and just tracing non-unique experiences to the ideas that those experiences help to generate. But I on the music angle, and also remember that my parents were both musicians and our family was traveling around, and they very much saw their ministry of interracial harmony, being expressed through music. So music was important, to me. It wasn't just like something you listen to and dance to. The messages and the way it made me feel were important in my coming of age. So, when Michael Jackson sings Never Can Say Goodbye, to me, I'm swooning. Like, oh, wow, this is just, so wonderful, to me. So I'm growing up listening to, songs that help to structure a new attitude about being Black. So Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. I mean, that song was monumental to my generation because we were colored, not Black, until that song came along. And when that song came along and you could dance to it and move to it, you could take in more readily the message and the re-examination of how we were presenting ourselves in the world. So I remember being colored and being Black. I also remember being a woman of affection to being a slut. And that was like a whiplash for me. Like, I'm dancing and I'm like, what are they saying?
She's a very kinky girl.
Or, if your girl starts acting up, then you take her friend. I mean, we're like going like this, and I'm like, why am I singing this? What am I saying? Or give me your sex. Or that. I mean, it's like there was a whole thing happening in my head as I was dancing to stuff that to me they were degrading. They were the opposite of what the soundtrack had implanted in me. And I didn't want that stuff. So I started pushing it out. Like, I don't want to dance to this. I don't want to minimize what the song is saying. I don't want to accept being called a bitch or a hoe. I'm not a bitch and I'm not a hoe. And I frankly don't appreciate, someone kind of in the family calling me that. I just don't. And so it kind of came to a head when Two Live Crew was prosecuted for obscenity.
Yeah.
And I had to analyze for my own self what I thought about the prosecution. And I did think it was racist. I thought that there were equally offensive things that white comedians and white artists were saying about women. I thought it was abundantly clear, like George Will had written an op-ed that tried to tie hip-hop to the rape of the Central Park jogger. I mean, it was sort of a direct correlation. And that was his argument for...
Because there was no rape before hip-hop.
No rape before hip-hop.
It had never happened.
It didn't happen,
And then the Last Poets released that album and then...
And that was it. And so that to me was the part of the argument that I think confirmed our concerns, the broad concerns about what happens when art is censored, and it's censored not just in terms of subject matter, but perspective. That really is a problem. So I wrote a piece critiquing it, but I also critiqued the defense of it, because the defense of it was effectively a cultural defense. That's just the way we talk. That's just the way we interact. So once again, I'm saying, what do you mean we? I don't accept people calling me this. This is not how I want to be, engaged. And it felt like a kind of, it was clearly an unpopular position, especially, as the beats got better and it was, hard to sit it out. My friends go, okay, well, we'll see you after. And I'm like, okay, I'm not dancing to that. But I think the politics of that cultural defense came to a head in the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill moment, because of the people who opposed Anita's testimony was a substantial number of people who believed that Clarence probably did do the things that she said, but offered a cultural defense to it. That's just the way we date. That's just the way we talk to each other. Where does that come from?
Well, you also talked about the sort of the prayers for Clarence Thomas, where she's referred to as a Jezebel.
Yeah,
and it, I'm a Muslim, so I've got no dog in this fight. But I'm familiar with the New Testament, and there is a certain irony at fallen women always remaining fallen somehow, and it's men who get salvation, as if you've forgotten about Mary Magdalene. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, as if you've forgotten what's actually fucking written in there.
You know that New Testament. And and so that's part of the, when I talk about, asymmetric solidarities, that's a moment, of asymmetry. And it is both a product of past asymmetries. So, I write about how sexual harassment was in significant ways a product of Black women taking the civil rights movement inside of their experiences as women who are employed in contexts in which they are exceptionally vulnerable to sexual abuse. So that is the story of Black women in the United States since we arrived on American shores. That's what enslavement was, industrialized sexual abuse. So the inability of our community to read Anita Hill's testimony not as she's just complaining and acting like a white woman, rather than she is occupying a position of Black women over the course of our history who have been subject to abuse and harassment in circumstances where race has made it less likely that they'll be believed, or even if they are believed, that there's a sense that an injustice has been done to them. She didn't have the language to rally African Americans and broader communities to that narrative. He did. He was able to say high-tech lynching. So the culture helps produce the terms of this asymmetry, which is why I can't not deal with it.
I want to sort of come towards the end of the autobiography where you reflect on the 2024 presidential campaign. And it's clear from how you write about it and how you still talk about it, you're saying this isn't just an urgent moment for like race politics and it's happening over here. Like, you know, what's at stake here is really democracy. And for me, there was maybe a sort of thing which I found difficult to match, which is that you've got the scale of the crisis, right? You know, a crisis bearing down on American democracy. And you have the avalanche of misogynoir targeting Kamala Harris, which absolutely happened. And you also had, in my view, a very weak candidate. You had a candidate who in the 2020 primaries drops out before the first round of ballots in the Iowa caucus. You have a vice president who is tied to the failures of Bidenism. She doesn't, you know, have her own thing, which is sort of separate from that. And a sort of, you know, the imagery around her at the Democratic National Convention in 2024, blasting Beyonce's freedom. There's a story there, right? This is a Black woman whose time has come. And outside are pro-Palestine protesters, and you've got delegates covering their ears. And when she's interrupted by Palestinian pro-Palestine protesters, she's saying, "I'm speaking." Right? So you have the weakness of this candidate, and then you've got the scale of the crisis. And I sort of, I don't think you're going to like this one, but she was attacked on the basis of her race and her gender. And her race and her gender were being invoked by Harris supporters and the Democrats to insulate her from criticism at the same time.
So there's been obviously a lot of conversation about how we put together the role of misogynoir, which is absolutely 100% in there, and the various policy critiques of her that people from the center to the left actually had. My first and most direct response is weaker than Trump. I mean, weaker than Trump. If her being a weak candidate explains it, then it should be in comparison to the one that won. I don't think anyone who makes the critiques of her candidacy can say, and on these issues, Trump was far out and ahead of her.
But you'd say weak in comparison to other possible Democrats and those who caucus with the Democrats.
But the election was between her and him. Every time we actually say, but she was a weak candidate, and not talk about the disaster he is and was, we allow his whiteness, his maleness, and his money to silently operate in the background as a starting position. If any of those things that he had done or he represented or he had said had been on her side of the ledger, not only would she have not been a candidate, everybody would have said that is crazy. So if she'd been convicted of sexual abuse, if she had had dozens of lawsuits against her, if she had been proved to have been a multiple liar across the board, if she had led an insurrection in which police officers were killed, if any of those things, any one of those things had happened, it would have been, are you crazy? But we don't even say, what is it telling us that he can have all of these things that are a disaster for democracy, and we're going to focus on what we see her weaknesses are?
See, here's where I disagree. So 2020 shows that Trump is beatable. Right? 2020 shows that Trump is beatable, right? Beaten by
a white man.
And I suppose if your argument is that it was Biden's whiteness, which means that he can beat Trump, I would say, well, of course, misogynoir plays a role. However, other things happen in those 4 years, which mean that you've got a suppressed Democrat vote, particularly over the issue of Gaza. So you have a collapse in Muslim and
let's
Arab
talk about
majority.
that, because Trump was not promising anything different than the Biden administration. And as we know, basically he has signed on to the genocide in a robust way.
Sure, but they stayed at home. They said, we're not going to give you our vote. We're not going to be, better of two evils into the ballot box.
And did that make sense?
I think that's how people vote. I think that people get sick
of the Tea
Party system.
The issue is more about the analytics of that moment. And let's go back a little bit and remember, Biden was, there's no daylight between Harris and Biden.
No,
on
you can
Gaza.
put a Rizzler paper between them.
That's right. So the fact that he got through in 2020 with or without the Gaza situation is still telling us that the differential between them does not boil down to that issue exclusively.
Not exclusively, but again, I'm thinking like what's happening in between those voices, and I think that I do just disagree here, which is she was handed the nomination. There wasn't a primary process, and this is what I actually like about American democracy. You have primaries, we don't. You get to weed out candidates over a period of time.
So here's what I disagree with you. We can go through all the processes in the world. We elected a man that tried to create a coup. A coup. So on his side of the line, he killed people, or he was behind the killing of police officers protecting the democratic process. We have this thing over here, an irregular primary. We're actually going to say that's a worse problem than the fact that he actually tried to kill people.
Not saying it's a worse problem. I'm saying that it is a sin to underestimate your opponent. And it is a sin on the part of the left or progressives or the center or whoever to not put your strongest candidate up against Donald Trump.
And I'm going to say it's a sin to underestimate and to underwrite the impact of Misogynoir on that moment, which is not just being against her, but writing a free check for him to be one of the most dangerous presidential candidate we've ever had. I can't simply say, yeah, the problem was she wasn't strong enough. I think the problem was he is able to wield the existing preferences for people like him to violate every rule in the book and still get elected. And we're saying, well, you know what, the primary didn't work well, and we didn't like her position on this, that, and the other.
Do you think a different candidate could have beaten him? Yes or no? Could a different candidate have beaten Trump?
Maybe, because of Misogynoir.
I don't think that's the only reason.
Well, but so we're going to disagree on that. We're going to disagree. And I'm puzzled about how we can look at rallies like the one that happened in Madison Square Garden, where she's basically called a whore. I don't see how we can look at all of the ways that the deep appeal to racism's past and present. I don't see how we can see that and then simply discount it and say, well, the real reason was that she wasn't a good candidate. Part of not being a good candidate has to do with the fact that she had this disadvantage, which is, number one, the fact that these are things that people were free and capable of saying. And number two, the media were not willing to take anybody to task about it. So if Misogynoir is capital that he had to spend, and she had nothing on her side that could make his various miscreant followers and actions costly, that is why that candidacy it was a failing one. It seems to me that saying that she was not a good candidate is allowing that capital to be spent to make her less attractive than him. That's, frankly, look, I haven't been excited about Democratic candidates in terms of their entire agenda for my entire life. That's not news. What is news is we have a Democratic candidate that is the only thing standing between us and fascism. And we went for fascism. I don't think that can be reduced to, oh, she was a weak candidate.
So I suppose things are slightly different here in that our two-party system is breaking up currently. We've got a five-party reality underneath first past the post, which tries to produce two-party outcomes. And the case being made by our Labour government is it's us or fascism in the form of the Reform Party and Nigel Farage. And what we have seen so far at this point in the electoral cycle is that it is not compelling people to get behind Labour. It is not compelling people to get behind the status quo. So Labour voters are staying at home. They're going for the Green Party, even if it means letting reform through. And I think that it is, you can put money on it now. I think that Nigel Farage will win the next general election. So we're not in a situation where you can say it is because of Misogynoir, all right? Keir Starmer is an adenoidal, white lawyer from the southeast. And it is that message of it's us or fascism, which doesn't inspire your base nearly enough. You have a right-wing authoritarian, racist populism on the other side, which is sweeping people up. And I just think, for me, it comes down to this thing of it is a sin to, when you know what the stakes are, to run a weak candidate. And I don't think that having the disadvantage of having Misogynoir hurled at her, which it did, right, which it absolutely was Kamala's only disadvantage.
Well, you didn't hear me say that it was her only disadvantage.
But I think that her main ones were the positioning over Gaza wasn't a huge vote loser, but it was in particular concentrations. Second one is that the Democrats had a problem, which is they were going on the TV all the time saying, economy good, line go up. And yes, inflation had fallen from 12% to 9% to 3%, prices still going up. And the thing which was determining and whether or not a voter would break for Trump was, were they most worried about their household finances? Like, that's what all the polling suggests. And so I think that she was unable to differentiate herself from the establishment Democrat brand. Anti-politics is kind of the only game in town. And she alienated a load of her core voters over Gaza. So that's not a country changer, but it means that your base is disengaged.
So, two things. I want to be clear. I don't agree with her position on Gaza. But I think that even if she had a position on Gaza that we agree with, she would have won that election. I just don't think that was the main reason or even a determinative one. What I still am puzzled about is how the rise of right-wing racism is erased effectively in assessing the strength of that politic. So even in your description of what's happening here, when you say it's a sin not to run a strong candidate against this movement, what I'm not hearing is, well, what are we going to do about that movement? And for many people, the strong candidate, and this is also going to the way that American pundits frame it, In America, the strong candidate is the one that does not talk about this or does not embody it. So when you have a moment of an unleashed racial fascism taking place, the candidate who doesn't talk about it and doesn't provide a target for this is seen as the strong candidate. Now, factually, that may be true, but it's not because distinct failing. It's because we don't have a way of dealing with the secret weapon that's not so secret anymore. The quiet parts are being said out loud. Now, there are those who say that the reason why the strength of the fascist right, the white Christian nationalists, is because, and I think you hinted at it, economic trauma. But actually there's polls that say that that's not necessarily what's causing it. So I want to go two different directions here. Number one, let's suppose that economic crises is creating the conditions in which some voters feel I'm being ignored, and so I'm going to move to the right. There are voters who are actually experiencing economic crises who are turned off by the racial claims that are supposedly being advanced. It's 92% of Black women voters. There are not other white voters who are suffering the same kind of economic disadvantage that they are, but still they heard in that message, in that appeal, a deeply troubling politic and repudiated it. So did Black men, 87% of them. So somewhere in this analysis, either we're saying, well, the only reason they're not mad is because it was a Black candidate, and that's not true, because those are numbers that we've seen before. It wasn't because of Kamala Harris. Number two, though, if you look at the people who were part of January 6th, a lot of the pundits are saying that's the consequence of economic crises in a Democratic Party that's not speaking to the white working class. Turned out most of those people were not part of the economically disadvantaged classes. They were small business owners. They were people who had lived relatively secure lives. It was xenophobia that drove a lot of that.
I mean, look, I don't want to preach the gospel to Pope Francis.
No.
But yes, I agree with you that the psychological wage of whiteness and racial supremacy, that has always been a part of maintaining a class stratified society. All right.
I agree.
So, from 1492 onwards, like this is the project of the invention of race as a technology of governance. So I agree that you cannot explain it all by economic anxiety, but I would say economic anxiety plus.
Sounds like an intersectional analysis.
Right?
I'm with you on that.
I agree. The second thing is on, I don't want to say Trump voters and January 6th rioters are exactly the same people, the same way that reform voters aren't necessarily the same people that came out and rioted for the asylum hotel, because you've always had this thing of you've got an electoral expression of the far right and you have a street far right. And it is a porous boundary between the two, porous and blurry, but it's not the exact same kind of people, right? You'll have your
there's a lot of overlap between them, and in fact, some of those people who were part of the January 6th were electoral activists. They were part of
but I'm saying voters rather than candidates, because candidates you're pulling from highly politicized people. Highly politicized people go on protests, which turn violent. But in terms of voters, it's not always exactly the same. And what we found here in the UK as well is that in 2024, when we had huge anti-asylum, anti-immigration rioting up and down the UK, is that the people who were arrested for violent offences fell into two categories. One is people who had completely fallen through our torn up safety net. And so you go back and you look in their stories and you see prison, mental health issues, in and out of the care system.
So quick question.
Yeah.
Clearly Black and brown people are in that category. Were they part of the rioters?
Not those riots, but we see them out in 2011 when we had our nationwide rioting following the police shooting of a Black man, Mark Duggan, in Tottenham. Yes.
Okay. So you have those.
They're not moral equivalents. They're not moral equivalents, but
my point is still the reaction to perception of being left behind versus the reaction to an actual action of racist violence. They're two separate things. And B, those same people who were out protesting the police killing, if they're not also out protesting because of economic, downward, movement, means that they have a critique of that argument that goes beyond the fact that they themselves are also experiencing this downward momentum.
But the thing that I would say is that there are I mean, the other thing I was going to say about our far right rioters is that you've got your people who've fallen through the safety net, who care experienced, been through the prison system, and you also have what you would call petty bourgeois, right? So own a kitchen fitting business, plumbers, electricians, 2 cars, nice house, lovely veneers in the teeth, right? That kind of thing.
Right.
You take away the catalyzing event, right? So the catalyzing event was what I believe to be a racialized police murder of Mark Duggan. And the catalyzing event was a perceived, right? It didn't happen this way. Misinformation was circulated online that an asylum seeker murdered 3 little girls at a Taylor Swift dance class.
Yes, exactly.
It wasn't, but it was the sort of... But where rioting took place in both cases were in areas hardest hit by deprivation. So you have an economic backdrop to both. You have a difference, right? One is a thing which actually happened. The other is a story being told around something that happened.
One is a punching down.
And so I'm not saying that these are moral equivalents, but if you ask me to do my anatomy of rioting, I'd say that there are things which join both: deprivation, state abandonment, protest masculinity, right? So, the idea...
But the analysis of these two moments is entirely different. One side sees the source of their downward mobility being these other people of color. That is a wrong analysis. The other sees their objection as the state's treatment of them. That is correct. So the fact that both of these things are happening in an arena of economic deprivation isn't telling us anything about how, as you said earlier, race has long been a feature of the management and the creation of political power. And none of these things will guide us to figuring that out if we allow the racial expectations and the assumptions not to be interrogated. And they're not being interrogated.
I think that this is what I thought and would have said 10 years ago. And I actually feel differently now. And what I think now is that actually happy people who have faith in a justice system that will treat them fairly, who can see investment and opportunity in their local environment, who feel that they have a strong associational culture, right? Like you're not just stuck inside and you're not lonely. They tend not to go around smashing up cars and burning down, in some cases, their own area where they lived. That's what happened in 2011. It's also what happened in 2024. And so I think that, and this maybe loops us back around, is I'm not sure if the best way we do anti-racism is always we must confront where race is right here. I actually think there's a ton of environmental stuff that we can do, which probably may well be a more effective form of anti-racism.
I would want to believe what you're saying. So first of all, I'm not sure if I'm saying necessarily that, but I'm going to be your devil's advocate.
Yeah,
I'm going to follow.
Because I'm not sure if I really believe this either, so let's just go for it.
So what I would say about that is I am not sure that the failure to dismantle the expectations of prioritization, and let me put it another way, there's dissatisfaction about downward mobility, and there's dissatisfaction about relative downward mobility. In other words, one of the things that I've been told as white person, of non-migrant background is that I'm always going to have a relatively more secure position than these other Black and brown people. I'm mad, not just about the fact that all of us are losing, but I'm losing relative to that. If we don't have a way of talking about that, if we don't have a way of suggesting how we go about disabusing people of the idea that, you know what, I might not have everything I want, but at least I'm white, or at least my people have always been here. If we don't have a way of disrupting that, and we don't think we need to deal with it, I hear in that, Black and brown people, you just have to sacrifice the fact that things are always going to be, or you're always going to be downstream from what's happening to everybody else. And that may include when these folks over here get pissed off enough, they may come after you, even though the real source of their problem is upstream. They're going to continue to look at you guys as the problem. Now, I don't know how much that describes what's going on here, but I know that's what's going on in the United States.
I think it describes some stuff. And certainly, I guess what I would call negative solidarity. So it's the opposite of solidarity. It's, well, like, as long as these people get it worse, it's a moral order that makes sense to me and I can live with. And that can be racialized others. It can be welfare recipients. It can be, so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
So I think that that's something which is really powerful. And I guess the thing I'm perhaps saying is that I think that people can only really interrogate and dismantle some of their most core held beliefs about themselves in relation to others, generally when people feel safe. And when people feel precarious, anxious, suspicious, hostile, that the ground's going to be torn away from them.
So what if safety means reestablishing a racial order?
So the thing I would say is this, is that you can create psychological safety and couple that together with the project, which is the abolition of race as a technology of governance, which is actually you have to create shared projects which involve brown people, Black people, white people, in saying, okay, the thing we've got to do is this rising tide that lifts all boats. That is the thing that we've got to do. And I think that...
So we have a name for that in the United States. Yeah. It's called the race-class narrative. And it goes back to what I was saying before. Yes, there may be racial hierarchies, but we can't afford to address those because effectively we will lose the people whose safety depends on reestablishing that hierarchy. And it doesn't have to be a technology of governance. In fact, that's what the whole project of colorblindness is. We don't have to be race specific in order to maintain a racial hierarchy. And the people who are invested in a racial hierarchy, they know that too. They know that too. That's what's happening in the United States right now with the effort to overthrow 60 years of voting rights access by using colorblind techniques to allow white people to not only elect folks of their choice in their own districts, but to break up Black districts so they have rights over there as well. It's all colorblind. It still produces a racial hierarchy. And at the same time, it eliminates the handful of African Americans who are elected to Congress. Now,
and that's really different from the context that we have here with our electoral system.
But what's not different about it is you don't need an explicit technology of race to maintain a racial hierarchy. And you don't need white people to basically oppose it in order to be comfortable. They are comfortable. It can be made comfortable by eliminating all of this stuff that has been created to deal with the history of racial exclusion.
But then conversely, and this is something which played out particularly here in London, is that we had really racialized differentiated outcomes in educational attainment. Super duper duper racialized through 70s and 80s. And then in the late 90s, in order to address this, you had something which was called the London Challenge. And basically what happened is the central government, like a rapper in a strip club, was just throwing money at London schools, just like this. And
making it rain.
It made it rain. And this is when I was going to school, all right? So suddenly they were like, oh, do you want to learn French? And I was like, mais oui. Like, you know, it was like night and day. And so inner city London schools went from being the worst performing schools in the whole country to being the best performing schools in the entire country. And now when you look at where racialized attainment gaps are most stubborn, it's when you are looking at deindustrialized areas in the north, coastal towns, which are predominantly white. You also have racial attainment gaps amongst Pakistani and Bangladeshi and Caribbean boys as well. But that's actually like been moving in a positive direction because of this model of you chuck a ton of money at inner city schools, London, Manchester, et cetera. Now, that was one of the most consequential policy decisions for dealing with what had been a really stubborn racialized outcome. And I wouldn't necessarily, to what extent is policymaking like this race blind? I don't know. I wasn't in these rooms. But it was something which said, okay, like we're going to do this by geography. And actually the outcome is you have a degree of justice as the outcome of it. And I think, my take is when people say, and white working class boys are being left behind, I'm like, look, London Challenge for everybody, right? London Challenge for Morecambe, London Challenge for Carlisle, London Challenge for Barnsley, right?
Yes.
Chuck money at the schools.
Yes.
Because this is a really stubborn class problem. But again, for me, this is an example of we had something which had some pretty profound anti-racist outcomes. And we did it through a model of it's a rising tide that lifts all boats in London. And it really worked.
So I come with a different moral of that story. From the United States perspective, rather than expanding on that model, which is 100% possible in the U.S., instead, the argument has been that is preferential treatment. And that preferential treatment is the constitutional unfairness that we have to eliminate, rather than saying we need to have a right to equal education. We need to have national standards. We need to give whatever the communities that are falling behind on those standards need in order to meet them. That, of course, is not on a table at all in a context where the idea is to dismantle the government and to create the idea that everybody is responsible for their own lack of achievement. Now, one might think if this was a rational moment, or if the idea that is being advanced is, the problem is that these communities are feeling like they're left behind. If that was really the case and it wasn't this punching down thing, the argument would be, we want some of that for all of us, right?
And look, the stuff gets channeled into the punching down. So, like, one of the features of Tory austerity and then everything that comes after Brexit is, the reason why white working class boys are failing behind is because you're talking about slavery too much. Now, obviously,
exactly,
that's fucking horseshit. And so my point is this, is that I suppose...
But why is there support for that? That's what I'm saying. If the idea is we all need to be elevated, or rising tide lifts all boats, then it should be we need these kind of resources to be targeted in ways that direct them to where they're needed most. Instead, not only is the problem, too much racism, too much slavery, too much genocide, whatever, too much anti-colonialism, rather than rejecting that as a specious argument, the voters, our voters, are jumping onto the idea that, yeah, that is the problem, even though everything around is showing that it is the defunding of the public sector, the defunding of education, the idea that you rise or fall on your own. Even though all of that is 100% clear, it is still difficult to maintain a winning coalition that goes at the idea of rising tide lifts all boats.
Let's talk, because I've kept you here for 2 hours now.
Has it been?
It has been 2 hours. So
Okay.
I'm going to give you the final word. Kimberlé Crenshaw on Downstream. What do you want to leave our viewers with?
I want to leave our viewers with the thing we didn't talk about much is the book.
Yes, it's, you know what, and like, if you like, I was underlining stuff. I really enjoyed it. I love biographical writing, and for me, my favorite thing about it is the motif of music, which comes back again and again and again. And you know, the mediations, especially on grief and loss, were just like gut punch, but incredible read.
So I guess, you know, to kind of square the circle, I am trying to reframe backtalking away from something that is frowned upon to something that we absolutely need at this moment. And so that backtalking is, of course, against authoritarianism, but also backtalking against the conventional wisdom that we walk around with, backtalking against some of the easy arguments about why we are where we are, backtalking sometimes not against, but in response to what our allies are saying. Really take the time to respond to what we're seeing and to be in active conversation like we've been for the last
I'm glad you
2
still
hours.
feel active conversation and not a hostage situation.
No, not at all. I love it.
Kimberlé Crenshaw, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that.
I can't wait to see what part of this is going to show up because there's a lot.